Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Astrology of Crime, Episode 2. Today, we're going to be looking at the Diane Downs case from 1983. So let's flash back to 1983. Ronnie Reagan was in office. He had been inaugurated in 1981. In his inaugural address, Reagan said, "I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So, with all of the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength, and let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams." In 1983, the recession had ended, and the U.S. entered into one of its longest periods of sustained economic growth since World War II. Reagan was a staunch anti-communist. He took a hardline approach to the Soviet Union. Domestically, his admin was focused on cutting taxes, reducing government regulation, and increasing military spend. All of this was known as Reaganomics. Nancy's Just Say No to Drugs campaign was well underway at that point. For music, our number one song on May 19th, 1983 was Beat It by Michael Jackson from his Thriller album. Other music that was really big at the time and playing on the radio was Modern English's I Melt With You, David Bowie's Let's Dance, Prince's Little Red Corvette, and What a Feeling by Irene Cara, which was made popular by the movie Flashdance. Top at the box office was Lone Wolf McQuade with Chuck Norris, Blue Thunder, Breathless with Richard Gere, Flashdance, of course, and Tootsie. Tootsie had come out in December of 1982, and it was still playing at the theaters, still going strong. And on the TV, The Jeffersons was still going strong. So was Cagney and Lacey. Dallas was huge. The whole Who Shot JR campaign was in 1980. Ripley's Believe It or Not was big. So was Knight Rider and Trapper MD. And that night, the San Diego Padres broke New York Mets' 4-game winning streak, beating the Mets 3-2. The crime took place in Springfield, Oregon. Springfield was like the scrappy sister of the more prestigious Eugene, Oregon. Eugene was a mecca for fitness, especially runners, and was known for their colleges, whereas Springfield was more hard-boiled, more working class. They would get their exercise in by going bowling on the weekends, for instance. On May 19th, 1983, at 10:40 p.m., Diane Downs pulls up to McKenzie-Willamette Hospital, laying on her horn. When the doctors and nurses rush out to see what's going on, Diane exclaims, "Call the cops, he shot my kids." In the car, you had Diane, of course. She was 27 years old. Little Danny was 3, Christy was 8, and Cheryl was 7. The father of the children was Steve Downs, though technically Steve wasn't the father of little Danny, though he did wind up taking to Danny very well. Diane and Steve were married in 1973, and they reportedly split in 1980, though it seems as if they were on again, off again. Hospital personnel said that Diane appeared to be in shock and spoke flatly, not showing any emotion. Diane had also been shot in the left forearm, though her wound was not serious. Diane claimed that she and the kids had been shot by a bushy-haired stranger. Investigators were suspicious of Diane from the start. They thought she was way too calm for somebody who had gone through something so traumatic. Diane had also wrapped her arm from the gunshot wound very carefully while her children remained untouched. Her wound was small and superficial, while her children's were grave, though Diane would not agree with the assessment that her wound was small and superficial. In an interview speaking about her injury in comparison to her children, she said, "Everybody says you sure were lucky. Well, I don't feel very lucky. I couldn't tie my damn shoes for about 2 months. It is very painful. It is still painful. The scar is going to be there forever. I have a steel plate in my arm. I will for a year and a half. I don't think I was very lucky. I think my kids were lucky. If I had been shot the way they were, we all would have died. So clearly we see here that Diane is not quite right. One of her children is dead. Cheryl died by the time they brought her into the hospital. Danny's paralyzed from the waist down, and Christy is hanging on by a thread. In addition to Diane's perception being warped, her story was odd. She explained that she and the kids were returning back from nearby Marcola to visit with a friend, but instead of taking the well-lit main highway, she decided to take the back roads for sightseeing. Problem with this is that she claims that the kids were sleeping and it was dark out. So why would you go sightseeing with your sleeping children in the dark? Diane claimed that after traveling for a bit, she saw a man standing in the middle of the road next to an ugly yellow car, signaling he needed help. Diane stopped the car and proceeded to get out. Now, this is very strange. You have 3 sleeping children in your car. Why would you stop for anyone? Now, leaving her children in the car, she said that she approached this bushy-haired stranger and said he pulled a gun out and demanded her car, to which she replied, "You've got to be kidding." She did a reenactment with police to tell them exactly what had happened, and during that time, she was very giddy. She's very jovial, laughing when talking about this experience that she had with this bushy-haired stranger. Diane said that she had sped off like a lunatic en route to the hospital, but Joseph P. Inman, who worked for the Springfield Water Board and lived in Eugene, was traveling along Old Mohawk Road that night and had to slow to a crawl because there was a red car with an Arizona license plate in front of him going only 5 to 7 miles an hour. So Diane wasn't speeding to the hospital. The theory is that she slowed down while driving to the hospital because she was waiting for her children to die. Suspicions grew even stronger when Diane visited her daughter in ICU and Christy's heart rate escalated to extremely high levels. She had grabbed her daughter's hand and kept repeating, "I love you," and witnesses thought they saw fear in Christy's face. The evidence didn't match Diane's stories either. There was no blood on the driver's side of the car, nor gunpowder residue on the driver's panel. After searching Diane's house, they found her diaries, the contents of which were mostly unsent letters written to a man, we'll call him Lou. In the letters, she assured Lou that her children would not be a burden to him. Quote, "They are terribly independent and require little care." Lou reported back to the police that Diane was stalking him and thought she might go so far as to kill his wife if that meant she had him to herself. Lou, along with Diane's ex-husband Steve Downs, confirmed with police that she had a .22 Ruger pistol. When police had asked Diane the makes of the guns she owned, she left out the Ruger, the model of the gun used to shoot the children. Although police could not find the Ruger, they discovered unfired casings in her home with extractor markings from the same gun used to shoot the kids. While her children were fighting for their lives in the hospital, Diane went on a media tour. In one of the most horrifying interviews, Diane speaks about how the image of her daughter choking on her own blood and dying in the passenger seat of her car still haunts her, and then Diane smiles. Local TV journalist Anne Bradley Yeager recalled, "The more she talked, and she talked a lot and frequently, the more things didn't make any sense. It was as if she thought that if she kept talking enough, that you would believe her." The police arrest Diane finally in May 1984. They just wanted to make sure they had enough evidence for an airtight case. And when she was brought to trial, Diane was pregnant. She said, "I got pregnant because I miss Christy and I miss Danny and I miss Cheryl so much. I'm never going to see Cheryl on Earth again. And I just, you can't replace children, but you can replace the effect they give you. And they give me love. They give me satisfaction. They give me stability. They give me a reason to live and a reason to be happy. And that's gone. They took it from me. But children are so easy to conceive. So here we see Diane wants to have a child, not to love, but so that she can be loved. Prosecutors explained that Diane wanted to get rid of her children so she could continue her affair with Lou, who didn't want any kids. The most emotional point in the trial came when Christy Downs testified in a halting voice that her mom was the one who shot her and her brother and sister. In June 1984, Diane was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. 3 years later, in 1987, Diane escapes. She escapes from prison having scaled a 12 to 15 foot high chain link fence. She sought refuge at the home of her cellmate's husband, and she was captured 10 days later. We ran the crime chart for when Diane arrived at the hospital. That was May 19th, 1983 at 10:40 p.m. in Springfield. First thing we do is we look at the ascendant to identify the victim. And the ascendant is in Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is Jupiter. So Jupiter informs what's going on in this crime with the victim. And Jupiter is conjunct Uranus. Uranus is shock, and Jupiter amplifies whatever it touches. So we see here the children were shocked at the incident. They were not expecting it. We see that ruling planet Jupiter is in the 12th house, which corresponds to anything hidden or out of view. They were on back roads. And the 12th house is also the house of surrender. So we can see that the children were at the mercy of the perpetrator being their mother. The first house expands upon the physicality of the victim, or victims in this instance. We see Neptune is here, which rules the unconscious, sleeping. They may have been confused. We look to the 7th house to determine the perpetrator of the crime, of the enemy of the victim. We see the 7th house cusp is at Gemini, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because Diane could not shut up. She just kept talking and talking and talking, which really led to her being caught. To get further information about the perpetrator, we look at its ruler, which is Mercury. And Mercury is in Taurus, and Taurus is a plotter. They tend to think things through and then get very decisive. Very rarely will a Taurus Mercury do something on the spur of the moment. They like a plan. We also see that the ruler of the 7th house, Mercury, is retrograde. So this would suggest that the perpetrator is in a disadvantageous position and will not be successful, which is the case in this crime. Planets in the 7th house further describe the perpetrator. Here we see Venus in Cancer is in the 7th house. Venus is woman. Specifically, it could be mother, and it also is in Cancer, sign of mother. The packed 5th house in this crime chart is very telling, and it makes a lot of sense. Themes of children, affairs, pleasure, and fun are 5th house, and that really is very relevant to this case. The children were having fun, visiting a horse in Marcola before the crime, and since we have 4 planets in that 5th house, they could represent everyone there that night since we had 4 people. The packed 5th house could even tell the whole story. You got Mercury, which could be backwards thinking or trapped in the past. Then we have physical trauma with Chiron in Taurus. Then we have that Chiron, that pain afflicting the sun, which would be Diane because she's a Leo. And then we have the afflicted sun taking action with a gun, Mars. First thing we notice in Diane's chart is that she is an Aquarius rising, making the ruler of her chart Uranus. and Uranus is in the sign of Cancer. So Uranus pertains to detachment as well as shock due to detachment. And the sign of Cancer is the sign of mother. So she was a detached mom, which actually made her a really great surrogate mother. Before the crime, she was a surrogate and she loved doing it. She loved being pregnant. She loved the attention on her from the family that couldn't conceive. And she loved doing something for a family that they couldn't do for themselves. When we look at Diane's fourth house cusp, which rules home and family, her foundation, we see it's in Gemini. And Gemini is ruled by Mercury. Mercury is in Leo at 17 degrees. That Mercury is making a near exact conjunction with Mars at 17 degrees. So you have Mercury and Mars both at 17 degrees, Mercury being communication, Mars being anger, aggression. She said that her father used to lecture them all the time. Her father had a thing with guns, shooting up her animals, which we'll talk about in a bit. But these energies, Mercury and Mars, which rule the family, oppose Diane, her ascendant. When we look at Diane's moon, we see it's in Aries. The moon in an astrology chart reflects how the subject experiences her relationship with her mother. So with an Aries moon, Diane may have experienced her mother as impatient, maybe self-focused, right? And that moon makes a sextile to Chiron over here. And Chiron is woundedness. So every single time Diane's emotions get triggered, the wound also pops up. And there's no interference here with her mother against anything that was coming at her from, say, her father, right? Wilhelmina was only 17 when she got married to Wes. He was 25. So before Diane was even born, there was an imbalance of power in the household. Wilhelmina was completely deferential to Wes, completely. She never spoke out on anything Diane said about her mother. Her father, spoke out on all subjects, everything. So we see that there as well. Anne Rule quotes Diane in Small Sacrifices as saying, there are more and more kids, and she, Diane speaking about her mother here, ran out of time. I used to sit around the house waiting for my mom to come and talk. She cleaned the house for my dad and spent time with my dad, not me. So very early on, Diane is getting a very clear message that a man's needs come before the children's. We also see that Diane had a quadruple conjunction in the sign of Leo, the widest orb being 6 degrees, Jupiter in Leo at 11, the Sun in Leo at 14, Mercury and Mars in Leo at 17, all opposing her ascendant, of course. But all of these planets, including Uranus, the chart ruler, and Venus in Leo at 8 degrees, are in the 6th house of service, work, lifestyle, scheduling. She had to be awake at like 4:45, 5 o'clock. She would ship the kids off to her parents, and then she would make her shift at the post office, and she was always on time. She was a very hard worker and really on top of what she did. She's very bright and very hardworking. And this quadruple conjunction, all 4 of these planets in Leo square Saturn, which is father, right? And the sun makes that square exact because Diane's sun is at 14 degrees Leo and Saturn's at 14 degrees Scorpio. So sun square Saturn may cause self-esteem issues due to criticism from authority figures like father. Jupiter square Saturn, that can surface as setbacks or criticism from parents that significantly impacts self-esteem and one's ability to grow and expand. And then you have Mercury square Saturn. Diane's thoughts and communications are criticized or thwarted by authority. Again, you weren't to talk back in that home. There was no interaction. The father held court and everybody listened. And then you have Mars square Saturn, which is a really big deal because that Mars is conjunct Mercury You got criticism or strict discipline growing up, which we know to be the case, resulting in rejection or defeat in sex, sports, work, any Mars-related activity. Plus, the buildup of this hot Mars energy needs a release, or it could escape in a violent, uncontrolled way, which it had in Diane's case. We also have Venus in Diane's chart, Venus being beauty, opposing Chiron, which is woundedness. So this can feature as feelings of awkwardness or ugliness, which we know to be the case. Wes, Diane's father, didn't let Diane dress like the other girls. Miniskirts were in at the time. Those were completely forbidden. He didn't even let Diane wear a bra for the longest time. He had her wear undershirts instead. And one time, according to Diane, Wes comes home. He talks about having seen this beautiful boy with short hair and a perm, and he has Diane get one. And the style at that time for girls was long hair, completely straight. So, of course, she's going to feel ugly, and she's going to lack confidence in her looks due to how she's made to dress. Now, at the time of the crime, we noticed that the transiting North Node at 25 degrees Gemini was making an exact opposition to Diane's South Node at 25 degrees. So the North Node is where we're going, and the South Node is where we're coming from. So at the time of the crime, the transiting North Node was activating her past experiences, what she already knows. In one of the many bizarre interviews Diane gave about the night of the crime, in one she said, "When this man shot my daughter, my first reaction was to snap back to my childhood, to the pain that had happened to me back then, my marriage, my entrapment by society. This man was bigger than me. He was stronger than me. He had more power because he had a gun. He was in control and I was not. And there was nothing I could do." So on first glance, this is preposterous. Her children are being shot up in her car, and she's thinking about her terrible childhood. Very strange, right? But even though we can say that this is a lie, because it's been proven that Diane did shoot her children, and she wasn't thinking this, she was probably thinking about how to kill her kids, it's interesting nonetheless that she uses this as a lie. This man was bigger than me. He was stronger than me. He had more power, etc. So Diane claimed at one point that her father had sexually abused her. Usually for sexual abuse, you might look for Pluto and Mars aspects. In this chart, Pluto is next to Mars, but the orb is rather wide at 9 degrees. Pluto also opposes the ascendant, but again, that's a rather wide orb at 6 degrees. In any case, with Pluto in the 7th house, Diane's relationships were certainly intense. Diane says that when her mom got a job at the post office, she would leave in the late afternoon only to return late at night. Diane says that that's when the abuse started when she was 11 or 12 years old. She would fear when her father came home and suggested it was family time. She claimed there was no intercourse. However, Diane also said that she had a strong tendency to blank things out, which assumes she disassociated and repressed some memories. Diane does speak of inappropriate touching and fondling. As the eldest of 5 children, Diane had her own bedroom. She said that her dad would often visit her in there, coming in there after work when her mom was at the post office. So Diane began to dread her father coming home every day. She was paranoid about what would happen. She would often go to bed fully clothed and would listen carefully for footsteps outside her door throughout the night. Sometimes, Diane said, if she were in the living room watching TV, her father would come home, turn off the TV, and lead her upstairs. It was truly a nightmare for Diane. And her mother keeps abandoning her. This time she's at the post office, but even if Wilhelmina was home and not working, she wouldn't have done anything anyway. because she was completely subservient to her father. So with her mother idly standing by while she's molested, and the abuse, and combined with her mother's indifference to Diane's suffering, it makes sense why Diane would have no empathy for her children whatsoever. Her mother overlooks Diane's safety in order to please Wes, a man. So according to Diane, that's the way love goes. Diane relays a story about driving through the desert with her father. One time her father asks her to remove her shirt in the car, and she does. But when he asks her to remove her bra, she was wearing a bra at the time, she cries. So if that story is true, we see that before her father had blocked her way with Saturn, and that during the episodes of abuse, he surrounded her. We have Diane's sun here and all of these planets around her. So when Diane is crying in the car, according to her recollection, thanks to some act from God, they get pulled over by a cop who sees that Diane is crying and thinks something is wrong. The cop takes her father aside, talks to him, and the abuse never happens again. So even if Diane's story of abuse, sexual abuse by her father, is untrue, we know by looking at her fourth house cusp, where Gemini is, that Mercury is the ruler. And Mercury is conjunct Mars. So somebody is calling Mercury the shots, Mars, in her home, and that's opposing Diane and calling the shots quite literally. Diane relays a story about one time her cats having ringworm, and Wes, her dad, being afraid of the kids catching ringworm, so he is going to dispose of the cats. And though she pleads with him not to, he does anyway. After hearing gunshots, knowing that Wes had killed her cats, she said, "I blacked out. I remember the sound of the gun, and the next thing I know, I was in my room putting on a clean blouse. I guess I ran out when I heard the gun. They found me later walking down the road. My foot was bleeding as if I'd kicked something. I had complete amnesia for an hour." Diane, on numerous occasions, says that she blanked out or blacked out. You go inside yourself, that's the same as blanking out. You're screaming, "Shut up inside." So we can see how Diane's traumatic childhood mirrors her disposition as an adult. She can't overcome the abuse emotionally, so she becomes the abuser. Now, we spoke before about how all of those Leo planets oppose her ascendant, but again, that ascendant in Aquarius also opposes these Leo planets. So at some point, Diane's going to fire back. Quote, "My father said that I was possessed when I spaced out for the first time. I was shouting at him. He usually hit me with a belt, but not this time. I looked at him. I told him to leave me alone. Maybe it surprised him. I guess my first anger backed him off." So in some way, Diane has to fire back. And with Uranus being the ruler of her chart in Cancer, with all these other planets, she's going to retaliate against those around her or her family because the chart ruler is in Cancer. And Diane is cognizant of the problem. She's very aware of the dysfunction in her home. In fact, she wants to stop the cycle of abuse. In an essay written from Mesa Community College just 1 year before the crime, she wrote, "The gruesome crime of child abuse not only destroys the lives of our children, but it usually brings terror into the lives of our grandchildren. Abused children develop different personalities depending on the type of abuse they receive and the amount of abuse they must endure. The personalities developed in abused children stay with them all their lives. They may receive counseling or some form of help, which turns the child around, but no one can take away the scars and pain inflicted on an innocent child forced to submit to mistreatment. It will ultimately affect that child's life as an adult. Then, when this scarred child turned adult has children of his or her own, these children are usually abused in some way or another by their parents. I wish we could stop this vicious cycle. If we could only take a whole generation and stop child abuse, we could wipe out the plague. Generation after generation, the abuse continues. If you abuse your child, he or she will no doubt abuse your grandchildren. This was written just 1 year before the crime. So if Diane had sought counseling or she worked hard to heal her emotional trauma in childhood, she wouldn't have had to seek out a physical solution, shooting the children. So when people can't heal an emotional problem, they seek out a physical solution, and usually that's crime. If you have any comments on this Diane Downs episode, I would love to hear them. Please put them below. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you next crime.